They say my name as if it were always carved in marble, but I was once a boy with mud on my sandals and fear in my chest. I was born into a household and lineage but fraying at the seams, patrician in name, plebeian in purse. My father died early. My mother, Aurelia, kept a mind sharper than most men's blades and a will that knew no retreat. Rome, in those days, had grown mean with its own glory. It devoured sons and then forgot their names. I was nearly one of them. When Sulla's shadow swept across the city like a thundercloud, all iron and execution lists, I was no more than 16. He had declared himself dictator, and his enemies vanished like morning mist. My uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, had once stood tallest among them. That blood was enough to mark me. Sulla summoned me and offered a choice cloaked in a threat. Divorce Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, his enemy. I refused. I did not refuse like a lion, but like a tree that bends yet does not break. They stripped me of my priesthood, my inheritance, my position, and I fled. Exile teaches many things. Hunger humbles. Cold instructs. But above all, distance lends a strange clarity. I walked among hills and silence, disguised, uncertain, yet my mind remained tethered to the heart of Rome. I read. I listened. I watched. Even in flight, I felt the city calling me back, not as a son, for Rome has no true sons, but as one of her many instruments. I knew then that power was not in office or title, but in perception. Even stripped bare, I still possessed one invincible thing, the will to return. They say I was captured by pirates in Cilicia, and that is true. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents. I laughed and insisted they ask for 50. They thought it arrogance. It was prophecy. I spent days among them, not begging, not pleading, but writing speeches and reciting poetry. I told them, calmly, I would return and crucify them all. They laughed, as men do when death is still a rumor. But I returned. And I did. Not with cruelty, but with order. One by one, as promised. That act was not about vengeance. It was about keeping my word. When I returned to Rome, the city was still stitched in the scars of Sulla's purge, though the man himself was dead. I walked among ruins and remembered corners where blood had dried into the marble. Names had changed, ambitions had not. Power, I learned, prefers old masks. The Republic wore the same senatorial toga, but its hands now trembled. The old class clung to tradition like a raft in floodwater, terrified of what came next. I would be that next thing. I studied law. I mastered speech. Not for its own sake, but because oratory was the closest thing we had to magic. With words, I could move men. With silence, I could wound. I watched the Senate, and I learned how power hides behind ceremony. I performed the rituals, bowed where I must, but inside I was already writing a new Rome. A Rome that would not fear its own citizens. A Rome where the state served the people, not the other way around. In those early years, I won small offices, the military tribunate, quaestor, aedile, stepping stones all. But I was not building a career. I was constructing a legend. At public games, I spared no expense. The people cheered me not because I was generous, but because I gave them a vision of joy. Joy is rarer than bread. They remembered my name. And in Rome, memory is worth more than gold. I had not yet tasted the Senate's wine, but I could smell its rot. Still, I did not curse it. I was never its enemy. I was its consequence. Some nights, I dream again of Sulla's stare, cold, calculating, cruel. They said he warned the Senate, in this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. I do not know if he truly said it. But I carry that phrase like a coin in my palm. I flip it, study it, listen for the ring of truth. He meant it as a threat. I wore it as a destiny. I was not born to be a king. I was born into a world where kings had been bled out, name by name, street by street. But even then, I understood, remove the crown, and the hunger remains. It only waits for someone bold enough to wear it again. And I was never afraid to bleed for Rome, if Rome would bleed for me. Even lions learn in silence first. Even storms begin with air. The boy the world forgets too soon returns as fire, with Roman flair. You must understand, Rome was not a city. It was a performance. Stone and blood and pageantry, yes, but above all, it was theater. And every man upon its stage wore a mask, whether he knew it or not. I, too, wore one. Not to deceive, but to survive. When I returned from my early postings in Hispania, I found Rome louder, hungrier, more unstable than I had left it. The people had begun to remember how to hope. That made them dangerous. And hope, like any fire, needed tending. I stood at the rostra and gave them the spark. I did not speak like the others. I did not drone in tired cadences or quote tired laws. I painted visions. I reminded them that the Republic was theirs. That the Senate should serve them, not scorn them. I named the injustice plainly. And the crowds answered me, not with applause, but with silence thick as thunder. That is when I knew, I had them. My voice became my sword. And I learned quickly that in Rome, a sword well used draws patrons. Crassus, richest man in the city, devourer of debt, extended his shadow toward me. He paid my creditors. Backed my campaigns. Whispered in my ear like a father might, if fathers in Rome still believed in sons. He thought me his investment. And I let him. Pompey, on the other hand, believed he was Rome. A general carved from old marble, fresh from triumph in the east, paraded through the streets in cloaks of purple, laurel on his brow. But he had returned from war to find the Senate suspicious and ungrateful. His soldiers needed land. His promises needed honoring. And he needed a voice that moved crowds. So he listened when I proposed we join hands, he and I. Add Crassus, and we became three pillars to a state crumbling under its own weight. They would call it the first Triumvirate. But we never spoke the name. It was not an oath, it was an understanding. Crassus brought wealth, Pompey brought steel, and I brought the people. Together, we ruled without ever wearing crowns. As consul, I gave the Senate spectacle and the people substance. Land reform passed beneath my words, despite the cries of the old guard. The optimates frothed like dogs leashed too long. But I smiled through it all. Let them shout. Let them wave their fists. I had already left the room, even as I stood within it. But I was never content to merely govern. I desired distance, not from Rome, but above it. I needed space to become larger than its walls. Gaul offered that. A province divided, rebellious, wild, and I, its governor. It was no exile. It was my canvas. Before I left, I gave my daughter, Julia, to Pompey in marriage. Not out of love, but as tether. A rope binding us against the winds to come. It was the kind of move that made senators whisper. But they did not understand. Rome had taught me well, when you cannot hold a man's hand with trust, bind him with family. And so I departed. I rode north with legions at my back and silence in my chest. I remember the night we crossed the Alps, the stars colder than swords, the air thin with fate. My men laughed, cursed, stumbled, but they followed. And as we made camp that first night on Gallic soil, I stood alone, staring into dark hills that did not yet know my name. They would. It was in Gaul that I was unmade and remade. There, I shed the robes of orator and clothed myself in command. There, I ceased to be merely a Roman, and became Rome itself. I did not write to the Senate for guidance. I sent dispatches for their awe. I conquered tribes they had never heard of. I bridged rivers they deemed impassable. I made winter my ally. Every battle won was not just land, but legend. I did not win through brutality, but brilliance. Speed, surprise, spectacle, that was my trinity. And my men? They followed because I bled beside them. Ate what they ate. Slept on dirt when they slept on dirt. I made myself not their master, but their mirror. Each victory made the Senate more nervous. Each line of praise from Rome grew sharper beneath its sweetness. They feared I loved the people too much. That the people, in turn, might love me more than they loved the laws. They were not wrong. I did not fear the Senate. I feared irrelevance. Rome was still a stage, but now I was the centerpiece. And yet, I did not forget Pompey. I wrote him often, praised him publicly. I kept the rope taut, but I felt it fray. When Julia died, childbirth, they said, as if death were ever so simple, that rope snapped. I remember holding the letter in my camp, miles from Rome, surrounded by quiet. My daughter, my link to peace, gone in a breath. I said nothing. I burned the letter. The embers told me what came next. From that moment, Pompey became a man of the Senate again. I could feel him slipping toward them, their whispers coiling around his pride. He had never needed affection, only admiration. And admiration is a fickle feast. Still, I marched on. Gaul bent, then broke. 1,000,000 souls folded into Rome's shadow. I sent riches back, slaves, gold, glory. They cheered me in the streets, even in absence. My name rang louder than consuls present. That was the danger. And so, back in Rome, the Senate schemed. They demanded I disband my legions. Return as citizen. Stand trial, if need be. I smiled. I saw their hand. They did not want justice. They wanted me small. But I had already outgrown their gates. Gold buys loyalty, but only blood earns myth. One voice can stir a crowd, but legions sing. The marble masks begin to crack. And still, the stage demands its king. The Rubicon is no river. It is a breath. A pause between the man you were and the thing you must become. When I came to its banks, windless under a leaden sky, the water seemed still, shallow even. A petty stream. And yet, all of Rome sat upon the far shore. Law, tradition, the Republic's trembling weight. To cross was to become an enemy of the state. To stay was to be unmade by it. My horse stamped the earth, impatient. The men behind me waited without voice. I alone had to choose. They say I hesitated. And I did. Not from fear, but from memory. I remembered my youth, Sulla's purges, the names scratched out of history. I remembered how power wears a smile before it shows its teeth. I remembered Pompey's hand once clasping mine, and how cold that palm had become. They had stripped me of immunity. They had declared my triumph a threat. They demanded I return alone, without army, without armor, as if the people's love could be unwound like a thread. And so I crossed. No fanfare. No trumpet. Just silence and the soft churn of hooves in water. I whispered, not for them, but for the fates, Alea Iacta Est, the die is cast. Not thrown with hope, but with certainty. There was no going back. Not for me. Not for Rome. From the moment we passed the Rubicon, we did not march, we moved like omen. Towns opened to us not with resistance but relief. Their hearts had long since left the Senate. I was not their tyrant. I was their reckoning. Pompey fled before me. He, the great, ran to Brundisium, then to Greece, taking the Senate and its last shreds of dignity with him. I did not chase in haste. I knew time was mine now. And time, like all things, bends to those who dare seize it. In Rome, the people welcomed me not with torches, but with tears. They called it civil war. But what war is civil, when only one side hears the people's cry? I stood in the Curia, alone, surrounded by empty benches where fat old men once sneered at me. I touched the marble with my hand and felt only dust. This was not Rome. Rome was in the streets. In the markets. In the fields. In the dreams of boys who no longer believed a senate could save them. But I was not content with an empty city. I wanted Pompey to see me crowned by absence, his absence. I wanted him to feel what it meant to be left behind. So I sailed. Across the Adriatic, the sea swelled against us like prophecy. My men, loyal beyond reason, followed into storms with bare feet and full hearts. We reached Dyrrhachium. Fought under rain, under hunger, under the vast quiet of a world unsure who to trust. I lost ground. I lost men. But I did not lose the thread. I followed Pompey to Pharsalus. That field was dry, flat, empty, the sort of place where legends die. Pompey had the numbers. He had senators in polished breastplates, horses thick with pride. I had veterans. Men who did not fight for Rome, but for the Rome I had promised them. He held the high ground. I gave the order to wait. To stand. To bleed, if need be, but not to break. When the dust rose, I sent a reserve cavalry I had hidden behind our flank. It was not brilliance. It was belief, that men who know why they fight cannot be outmaneuvered by those who merely remember how. Pompey fled. Not to rally, not to fight again, but to vanish. To Egypt. He sought refuge in kingdoms where gold buys loyalty and honor dies with the sun. I followed, as always, not with vengeance, but with vision. But when I arrived in Alexandria, the welcome I received was a severed head. Pompey's. A gift, they said, from the boy King Ptolemy. A favor meant to earn my smile. But I did not smile. I looked down at the remains of the man who had once called me son-in-law, and I felt no triumph. Only cold. I had not come for blood. I had come to end the war with a word. They had denied me that word. They had killed the mirror of my past. And in doing so, they made me something else entirely. I ordered rights. I wept, not for him, but for what we might have been. For the days when compromise still seemed possible. For the boy in me who once believed alliances could outlast ambition. But Rome had no more room for compromise. And neither did I. So I remained in Egypt. Not as conqueror. Not yet. But as a man who understood now that lines, once crossed, do not vanish. They become the roads we never return from. One step, and the river forgets its name. One act, and the mask dissolves. Power does not shout, it waits. And when we cross, we never walk alone. Egypt was no province. It was a dream, dusted in gold, draped in riddles. Alexandria shimmered not like a city, but like a mirage conjured by men who had forgotten what stone felt like. Marble, glass, flame, and language, more tongues than I had heard in any Roman square, each speaking in layers, none asking permission. It was not my world. And yet, it received me like a long-awaited storm. They called her Cleopatra. She did not walk, she arrived. Veiled in silk and silence, with eyes that did not bow, even to Rome. When they first unfurled her from the rug in which she had hidden, brought into my chamber under nightfall like a whisper Rome would not hear, I did not rise. I watched. She stood before me, barefoot on cold stone, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She spoke not of love, nor of war, but of legacy. Of empire. Of what endures when men like us become dust. I had met kings. I had broken consuls. But never had I seen someone who understood so fully the architecture of power. She did not seek protection, she offered it. A throne trembling beneath a boy-king brother, a civil war within her palace, and yet she stood as if Egypt itself rose and fell at her breath. She asked me not to stay. She dared me to. And I did. The months passed in smoke and marble halls. We fought no battles, but I felt more challenged than in all my years in Gaul. Her court was a tangle of spies, scholars, dancers, and liars. Each word a coin tossed, each glance a move in a game older than my republic. Yet I did not falter. I had not come only to settle Pompey's death. I had come to glimpse what Rome might become if it dared look east, not for tribute, but for transformation. Together, we conceived a son. Caesar Ion, they would name him. A child born not from desire alone, but from intent, a symbol stitched from two worlds that had never truly touched. I knew he would never rule Rome. But he would haunt it, in blood and memory. Still, I could not remain. Rome called. Its heart beat louder in absence. I had left senators trembling, tribunes scattered, and laws half-born. If I stayed too long, I would not return to a city, but to a tomb. Before I left, Cleopatra asked me a question. If you could rebuild Rome in your image, she said, her voice low as dusk, what shape would it take? I did not answer. Not with words. I kissed her palm, the hand that held a scepter and offered no chains, and sailed away with silence stitched to my breath. Back in Rome, I returned not as a victor, but as inevitability. The Senate gave me titles to bind my ambition, unaware they were tying laurels to a tree already felled. I became dictator, first for a year, then for 10. And still, they bowed. Not because they believed, but because they feared what would come if they didn't. I did not rush vengeance. I granted amnesty to those who had opposed me. Called back exiles. Restored property. I understood that peace requires spectacle, but stability demands mercy. Still, I knew mercy buys silence, not loyalty. I rebuilt Rome's bones. The calendar, realigned with the stars. The coinage, my image, no longer faceless Roma. The Senate, swollen with new blood, many from the provinces. I did not seek to destroy the Republic. I only gave it a face it could no longer ignore. Some whispered that I sought a crown. But I wore none. At the Lupercalia, Mark Antony offered me one, a crude thing of gold and intention. I waved it away. The crowd watched. Some cheered. Some frowned. I smiled. I knew then that a crown was not a thing to be worn. It was to be felt. Heavy. Invisible. Inescapable. I had become more than a man. And Rome, more than ever, needed to believe that a single figure could hold its contradictions in his hands without breaking. But the air had changed. Where once I had moved among the people, now I saw fewer streets. More palaces. Fewer names. More murmurs. The Senate no longer debated, it waited. The people no longer demanded, they watched. And I found myself writing more, speaking less. Nights stretched longer. Dreams grew stranger. In the quiet, I would think of Egypt. Of the Nile. Of a boy not yet walking, carrying two worlds in his blood. I had ascended every step. There was only one left. I did not know then how narrow the top could be. Or how lonely. A throne built without mortar will still fall. Even stars, burning bright, cast shadows on the earth. What is a crown but a question unanswered? And who dares answer it aloud, in Rome? Power grows heavy not when taken, but when held too long. I had no rival left in arms, no challenge left in words. The Senate, once a chorus of schemers and thunder, now sat like aging actors reciting lines no one believed. And yet, in their silence, I felt the weight of 1,000 daggers sheathed behind their robes. It is not the lion that terrifies men, it is the shadow he casts across their future. They named me Dictator Perpetual. Eternal Dictator. Not king, not in name. The Republic could not stomach that syllable. But the meaning was clear. I accepted the title not with joy, but with necessity. The Republic was a dying script, and someone had to keep the theater from collapsing. Let the old men pretend the curtain had not already fallen. I still walked the streets. Still sat among the people when I could. But something had shifted. Faces that once glowed now watched. I had not changed. But they had. Adoration calcifies into awe. Awe, into silence. And silence? Silence gives birth to fear. They said I sought a throne. That I would place it upon the Capitolium and crown myself beneath Jupiter's eye. That I would name Caesar I on my heir. That I would strip Rome of her soul, stone by stone, until only my voice remained. But I never spoke those words. I never declared such dreams. That did not matter. In Rome, rumor is louder than reason. And so, the Senate began to whisper again. Not as a body, but as a collection of men, desperate to matter. Cassius, lean and sharp, always watching from corners, eyes like knives never drawn. Brutus, who called me friend. Son of Servilia, who once lay in my bed, and whose son I held in trust as a reflection of all Rome might yet be. They met in shadows. Not to conspire, they told themselves, but to preserve. To protect a republic already embalmed in ritual. To strike not at me, but at the fear of what I symbolized. And yet, as they sharpened their resolve, I moved on as if fate had not yet chosen its time. I planned campaigns to Parthia. To the east, where Crassus had failed and where glory still shimmered just out of reach. I intended not to conquer, but to complete. To stitch the empire into a single breath, from ocean to river, from Gaul to desert. The Senate had already voted in my favor. The people had already called me father. Only the sky had not yet opened. On the morning of the Ides, Calpurnia pleaded. She dreamt of statues weeping blood. Of my body in her arms, lifeless. I smiled and soothed her, not because I believed she was wrong, but because I believed I was already beyond the reach of knives. When you've survived pirates, Sulla, Gaul, and Pompey, a handful of senators seems a poor threat. I made no armor of paranoia. I wore no breastplate beneath my robes. I walked to the Senate as I had always done, open, unguarded, full of breath and certainty. The theater of Pompey. How ironic, that name. I remember thinking that as I entered. His monument became my tomb. When I saw the faces, too many for that hour, too still for any civic business, I felt the air change. Not cold. Not dread. But inevitability. As if history itself had paused, waiting to be written in red. I greeted them. Some did not answer. Some smiled too long. And then, a hand. A pull of cloth. A blade. Cassius, perhaps. Or Decimus. I cannot say. When betrayal begins, faces blur. Only pain sharpens. They struck in a circle, not in fury, but in order. Like a ritual older than gods. I staggered, not from fear, but confusion. These were not warriors. They were ghosts of a republic already dead, trying to make my body its final offering. Then Brutus. Yes, I saw him. Not last. But most clearly. His face did not twist in rage. It trembled. The boy I once protected. The man Rome said might have been my son. Tu quoque, brute. Not accusation. Not anger. Only release. I did not fall from power. I was delivered into legend. My blood, not shed in war, but on polished stone, became the ink with which the next Rome would be written. And they, the saviors, found no cheers. Only silence. Only smoke. Only the echo of what they had tried to kill. Not every knife is drawn from hate. Not every crown is made of gold. The Ides come not with thunder. but with footsteps soft as memory. They say the world changed the day I died. But death is no thunderclap. It is a closing door. And mine shut not with screams, but with the quiet rustle of robes, the slow retreat of sandals on marble, the murmur of men who had hoped to feel cleansed and instead felt hollow. My body lay where it fell, at the base of Pompey's statue. His stone gaze staring forever forward, mine dimmed below. They left me there. No rites. No mourning. Only the faint drip of blood across old marble, mine, mingling with the shadows of the past. The great Caesar, not slain in battle, not lost in sea or storm, but felled by men whose hands shook even as they struck. Did they feel triumph? No. Only the weight of what could not be undone. Rome did not erupt. Rome did not cheer. The Forum did not fill with liberated souls crying joy to the heavens. It watched. In stunned silence. As if the sun itself had paused in its climb. Mark Antony found me first. Not as a soldier. Not as consul. But as a man bereft of anchor. He lifted what was left and saw not a fallen tyrant, but a friend who had reached too far into the future. I had named him co-consul, yet even he had not been trusted with the plot. They kept him from the truth, knowing that Antony's fire might scorch even them. He tried to speak to the Senate. To reason. To calm. But Rome is not calmed by reason. It is swayed by symbol. And I had become the greatest symbol of all. The will was read in the Forum. My voice, from parchment. My hand, still shaping the days beyond my end. I gave land to the poor. I left money to each citizen. And in doing so, I took from the conspirators the only thing they had left, the illusion that the people might thank them. They had killed a man. I had become something else. The crowd wept. Not for me. But for what my death revealed, that even in death, I gave more than those alive ever had. The pyre was not planned. It was built by grief, fed by rage. My body burned in the open air, not like a criminal, but like a king they had refused to name. Antony stood before the flames, reading my words, voice breaking. The people tore through the city, hunting the names whispered in the Senate's darker corners. Brutus fled. Cassius hid behind proclamations of liberty. But no banner of freedom ever dried the blood they had spilled. They had sought to stop a king, and awakened an empire. And Octavian, my great-nephew. Adopted by my will. 17. Unassuming. Watching, always watching. He arrived quietly. No laurels. No triumphs. Just the name, Caesar. And with it, all that came after. They thought him a child. But I knew him. Where I burned hot, he burned cold. Where I moved men by force of breath, he moved them by silence. He would not claim power through speeches or swords. He would let the Senate crown him themselves, thinking it their idea. He would finish what I began, not with glory, but with permanence. Rome would become what it feared most. Not a republic. But an empire wrapped in marble law. And all who followed him would wear my name. Caesar. Not a title. A myth. I do not regret what I became. I regret only that Rome was never ready to choose. Had they given me the crown, I would have worn it lightly. Had they kept the republic, I would have served it fully. But they gave me neither. Only the blade. And from it, history. You cannot kill a storm by naming it. You cannot cage a god with knives. They buried a man. But awoke a Rome that no longer sleeps. I had no son in Rome. No living child to carry my name through its crooked streets, no hand to rest upon my shoulder as I passed from man to marble. But in the ashes of my pyre, one rose, not by birth, but by choice. Gaius Octavius. My sister's grandson. Barely grown, thin of limb, pale of face, yet when I looked into his eyes, I saw what most others did not, a quietness that did not tremble. He came to me in Apollonia when I still planned my march on Parthia. He spoke little, but he listened like one preparing not for service, but for rule. He watched the world with the patience of stone, as if time itself were just another army to outmaneuver. When I named him heir in my will, the Senate scoffed. He was a boy, they said. Untried. Unknown. Rome would never follow a shadow. But they forgot, Rome follows names. And I had given him mine. He returned to the city not with legions, but with legacy. My seal. My gold. My memory. And the people, gods, the people, they reached for him as if he were breath after drowning. He promised justice. He promised the Republic. He promised to punish those who had torn their beloved Caesar from them with blades in the back of honor. But Octavian was no avenger. He was an architect. He aligned himself with Mark Antony, though the men could barely hide their contempt for each other. The alliance, stitched from necessity, was called the Second Triumvirate. With Lepidus, a fated general, as its third leg, they swore to restore order. But restoration in Rome always begins with ruin. The proscriptions came swiftly. Lists. Names. Executions. Not of enemies alone, but of debts, favors, and futures. Cicero, who had danced between loyalty and resistance, found his name among them. They say his tongue was nailed to the rostra, that old rotting stage of rhetoric. A warning, not from rage, but from strategy. Rome bled. And from that bleeding, order was born. They marched against Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. The battle was less one of swords and more of ghosts. My shade stood between them, felt in every clash of blade and shout of war. Brutus, the last hope of the old republic, died not with defiance, but with exhaustion. He fell on his own sword, as if Rome itself had finally asked too much. Antony triumphed in the east. Octavian returned west. And then, the alliance began to fray, as all false unions do. Antony's gaze drifted to Egypt. To Cleopatra. Yes, her again. He followed her not only with his heart but with his future. He named children by her. Made promises to the east. And worst of all, he allowed Rome to wonder, would he be Rome's master, or Egypt's servant? Octavian knew. He always knew. He did not accuse at first. He waited. Let Antony betray himself, one speech, one coin, one kiss at a time. And when the time came, Octavian did not attack Cleopatra. He attacked the image of her. The queen, the seductress, the foreign sorceress. He turned the people not against Antony the man, but against Antony the myth undone by desire. I watched from beyond, as all things burn into myth must. The final war came not on Roman soil, but at sea. Actium. Antony and Cleopatra fled before the battle turned. Not in cowardice, but in the realization that destiny had already chosen. Their fleet crumbled. Their will broke. And when the end came, it came not with a charge, but with poison and despair. Octavian returned alone. The Senate bowed. There would be no third triumvirate. No new alliance. Only one name. Mine. But not mine. His. Caesar. Augustus, they would call him. Revered one. But beneath the laurels, behind the marble smile, he carried me always. Not as memory. But as foundation. I was the storm. He was the sky after. You may shatter the blade. But not the hand that forged it. I was the lightning. But he became the day. I did not live to see the crown placed upon his brow, yet I felt its weight all the same. Rome, that restless city of stones and screams, finally exhaled beneath one name. Augustus. Princeps. First among equals, they called him, as if by softening the title they might forget what it truly was. Not a king. No, never that. Rome would never kneel to a king, but it would embrace an emperor, so long as the robes were clean and the rituals intact. And so he ruled, not from above, but from the center. Quietly. Completely. He named no throne, and yet every seat of power bent toward him like reeds in wind. The Senate still met. Still voted. But only on what he allowed them to see. The consuls still spoke, but only in echoes. Rome had chosen, though it dared not say the word aloud. And every temple, every coin, every edict bore my name, Caesar, as though I had not died, only multiplied. He knew what I had known, but could not finish. That the republic was too fragile to mend. That the people needed not a council of fathers, but a single voice. And unlike me, Augustus was patient. Where I charged, he calculated. Where I reached, he waited. I had torn down the doors. He remade the house. And all the while, he kept me beside him, not in spirit, but in stone. Statues of me rose like guardians over the empire. My image stamped into silver and gold, pressed into the palms of shepherds and senators alike. Children spoke my name before they understood its meaning. I had become Rome's mask. And in wearing it, Augustus gave shape to the empire I had only begun to imagine. He honored my reforms. Kept the calendar I had aligned with the stars. Preserved the laws I had reshaped in war's shadow. But more than that, he made permanence of what I had offered as thunder. The provinces no longer bled from neglect. Grain flowed. Roads stretched like veins across mountains and deserts. Even Gaul, once wild beneath my blade, now whispered in Latin prayers. He brought peace, the Pax Romana, they would call it. And yet, it was not peace born of harmony. It was peace born of awe. Of Rome's unmatched weight pressing down on the known world. That weight bore my name. Every province that bent the knee did so in shadow of Caesar, though I no longer breathed. Still, in the quiet, I wonder, did he envy me? Did he fear me? My memory was a mirror in which he could not help but see himself. He adopted my heirs. Honored my line. But he never allowed a son of mine to rise. Not Caesaron. Not the boy born beneath Alexandria's jeweled sky. That child vanished from record. Quietly. Entirely. Perhaps lost in the Nile, or beneath a blade. Perhaps merely forgotten. But not by me. Cleopatra once told me that Egypt remembers differently. That memory there is written in stone, not scrolls. Perhaps somewhere, beneath sand and silence, our son remains, not as ruler, but as echo. I held no bitterness. Augustus did what I could not. He turned chaos into order. Made myth into mechanism. But in doing so, he buried what Rome had once been, a city of fierce voices, a republic of ambition and betrayal, of orators and daggers and dreams. Now, it moved as one body. Efficient. Fearsome. Silent. I, the storm, had awakened the world. He, the architect, had told it to sleep. And in its dreams, I lived on. Names do not die, they harden. Statues do not breathe, they endure. The empire does not forget its first thunder. Only teaches the world how to tremble softer. Time erodes memory, but not fear. And though my body had long returned to dust, my name remained, not as a man, but as a shape cast across centuries. Even in death, I was present at every triumph and tremble of the new Rome. And nowhere was my presence more vivid, more unspoken, than in the Senate itself, the hall of my old tormentors, once swollen with pride, now hollow with obedience. The men who sat there still wore togas, still raised their hands in vote, still called themselves the guardians of tradition, but I could feel the truth beneath their robes. They were keepers of ritual, not power. What had once been a fire was now incense, sweet, perfumed, and meaningless. They did not dare speak against Augustus. They did not even dare think it. For the memory of knives drawn too early still hung in the air like the scent of iron. I had bled in that chamber. My fall had stained its stones. And now, the men who once plotted and poisoned and postured could not even whisper dissent without fear of their own echo. They had killed me for ambition, and then built an empire from the same dream. Sometimes, I watched them. Not with eyes, but with the cold patience of the forgotten. I stood behind the shoulders of young tribunes as they repeated lines they did not believe. I listened to the old patricians grumble over the shape of provinces, the price of marble, the harvests of Sicily, safe in their comfort, distant from their former fire. The republic they claimed to defend had not been murdered. It had dissolved itself, piece by piece, through cowardice and compromise. I had only named the truth. There were no more Catos. No more Ciceros. Only senators who smiled too easily and bowed too deeply. Their power lay not in speech, but in surviving the silence. The Senate had become a theater without audience, a choir mouthing hymns to gods long fled. And yet they still feared me. They could not help it. Every law passed in my name, every calendar that bore my months, Julius, Augustus, reminded them of what they had tried to end. Even when they tried to erase me from the lists of the divine, the people would not allow it. My statue, torn down, was rebuilt in secret. My likeness returned to coins, not as ruler, but as ancestor. Not as tyrant, but as father. Divus Julius. The deified Caesar. It was not reverence that kept me alive. It was unfinishedness. For even in all Augustus built, the wound of my death never quite healed. The image of my fall was too perfect. Too poetic. A man stabbed beneath a statue of his enemy. A friend among the murderers. A city that watched and wept too late. And I did not rest. I drifted through marble corridors, into the corners of Rome where ambition still whispered. I stood beside the boys who read of my wars in the dim corners of academies. I walked behind generals who invoked my name before battle. I listened to crowds in amphitheaters chant my titles without knowing their weight. I remained, not because I wished to haunt, but because Rome never let me go. Augustus aged. His rule grew colder, more intricate. He built laws like walls, and within them, Rome began to forget the thrill of risk. Peace reigned, yes, but it was a peace of weary bones. Of old men writing history as if it were myth already. He knew what I had known, that peace is always temporary, that beneath every triumph lies the tremor of rebellion. He named his successor carefully, adopted and prepared him, repeating the pattern I had set. But none of them would be me. Not Tiberius. Not Caligula. Not Nero. They wore the name Caesar, but not the soul. Rome had many emperors. But only one first. Only one spark. They used my death to justify their caution. But it was my life that gave them their empire. A chamber once filled with fire. Now warms itself by my ashes. They crowned silence as victory. But my echo still moves the stones. I have watched the centuries. Not as a god, for the gods are myths that bend to men's needs, and I was always more dangerous than that. Not as a ghost, either. Ghosts drift in sorrow, trapped by longing. I am not trapped. I am remembered. And that is a far heavier tether. My name has crossed deserts and oceans, carved into temples and echoed in the mouths of emperors I never knew, etched on coins by hands that never saw my face. They call themselves Caesar still, in lands I never dreamed of, Kaisers, Tsars, shadows in every tongue. Yet none of them understood what I did on the day I fell, that Rome did not die with the Republic. It was born anew, redrawn in the blood of its old convictions. I have watched empires rise under my banner, and fall beneath it. I have seen tyrants cloak themselves in my image, and martyrs whisper my name before death. I have seen the marble of my likeness shattered by enemies who feared what it represented, and rebuilt by grandchildren of those same enemies who found, in the pieces, a strange kind of hope. They say time erases all things, but time has only sharpened me. They remember my victories, Alesia, Pharsalus, Thapsus, but it is not the battles that endure. It is the decision. The crossing. The moment one man stood before a river and stepped across, knowing the old world would not follow. Men still debate me. Was I a tyrant, or a savior? A traitor, or a prophet? They ask if I killed the Republic. But the truth is simpler. The Republic had long since bled out on the Senate floor, in years of stagnation, greed, and fear. I only held the mirror to its face. It was already dead when I offered to crown its corpse with purpose. Even those who pierced me with blades did so not to save the past, but to preserve their comfort. They did not love the Republic. They loved its memory. I was not the end. I was the reckoning. I was what happens when a city forgets that its people are its soul. And that soul had cried out for someone to see them, feed them, lead them. I did. And for that, I was made eternal, not by my will, but by theirs. The Senate built its temple to me after my death, thinking to contain me in divinity. But no shrine could hold what they had unleashed. I was no longer Caesar, the man. I had become the idea. The hinge upon which all history turned. The old Rome fell because it could not carry itself forward. The new Rome stood because I became its spine. But know this, I never wished to be a god. I only wished to be remembered as one who saw clearly. Who understood that history does not wait for permission. That justice without power is a song sung to empty hills. That Rome, in all her cruelty and splendor, needed not just senators, but vision. And I gave her that. I gave her a horizon. And when the knives came, I did not curse them. I did not cry out. I did not beg. I saw the fear in their eyes, not of me, but of what I meant. I saw Brutus, and I saw a boy who had once believed in better things. I saw that they thought they were ending something. But they were beginning it. Even now, the world waits for the next Rome. The next man to walk a crumbling bridge with fire in his eyes and fate at his heels. Perhaps he too will be called tyrant. Perhaps he too will fall beneath the weight of his own becoming. But if he carries the people in his breath, if he dares to speak not to marble, but to hearts, then he too will be remembered. Not as king. Not as ruler. But as Caesar. The Ides never end, they only move. From blade to word, from throne to street. A name once spoken in blood. Now marches endlessly on the lips of empires. Caesar, still watching.